Speaker, I've got quite a lot to say in this particular point, and I'll try to bear in mind the time constraints. Can I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Gordon, for bringing this debate to the Chamber today. I myself will also declare a personal interest because my younger brother Brian and my two younger sisters, Claire and Delia, my three siblings are profoundly deaf. And equality is a word that we bandy about in this House quite often. But I'll make this statement that deaf people in the United Kingdom have never had equality in respect of education. And it's thanks to deaf campaigners, people like my parents, Bridget and Charles McCann, who campaigned for their deaf children because they were those self-same parents that the Right Honourable Member for Gordon mentioned, who suddenly had a deaf child and didn't get any access to services to support them. But the fight goes on, and the motion highlights that we still have much work to do, and the fear and danger that local authorities may cut back on deaf services for children and young people. The NDCS have evidenced the suggestion that education services for deaf people may be cut, and in fact we shouldn't be talking about a cut. If we genuinely seek to bring equality for deaf people, the services must be increased. Now, colleagues will have noticed my Scottish accent and the fact that I recognise a seat in Scotland which some people have some difficulty in pronouncing, East Kilbride, Straven and Lesmahagel, particularly the last part. But the reason that I enter this debate is to also flag up that Scotland is a year behind the cuts, the austerity measures that have been brought in for local government. I don't mention that in a party political sense, but if you remember, David Cameron, the Prime Minister, did agree with the First Minister, Alex Salmond, that Scotland would retain its budget in 2010, so we're a year behind the curve. And there's already speculation in Scotland about local government services being cut. And again, I would also suspect that when it comes to areas that are being looked at, then services to deaf children and young people are also in danger. So that's the relevance of my participation in this debate today. I won't be ungenerous, Madam Deputy Speaker, and suggest that we haven't made some progress in the last 40 years. But let me just tell you my experience with my brothers and sisters. I remember the grey bus arriving in front of our house in East Kilbride. And on the grey bus were children with every disability you could think of. Physical disabilities, physical and mental disabilities, deaf, blind. And that amalgamation of challenges of children with disabilities led to two things. First of all, it dumbed down education, because the school that the children then went, my brothers and sisters went to, the education was carried out at the lowest common denominator, rather than challenging the kids to do the best that they could. And there was also the stigma. And you can imagine that children can be cruel. And I have to say, as an elder brother, I ended up with a few second prizes in the pugilism stakes. But if your brothers and sisters' honour is challenged, or they're criticised in some way, or they're taunted by other children, then you step in and defend them. But children can be cruel. But we should remember that it was the adults, the educationalists at the time, who created the system which enabled children to be cruel. And the inequality of 40 years ago was palpable. Profoundly deaf children were not allowed to sign. In fact, as Right Honourable Member for Gordon mentioned, in terms of British Sign Language, we actually made up our own sign language in the House because there was no formal language to communicate in. And believe it or not, my brother had to sit, forced to have his hands behind his back, unable to communicate in the classroom, despite the fact he was profoundly deaf. There was no access to the curriculum that I had as a hearing child for deaf children 40 years ago. And that meant that their ability to learn was stifled. Bright, young, deaf children consigned to the dustbin on the day and hour that they first entered their primary school. I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, that my brothers and sisters have done very well in their own adult lives, mainly because of my parents who refused to take no for an answer. And they refused to take on board what the educationalists of the time said was good for those children. Because the perceived wisdom of the day was that you listened to the educationalists, and if you were a hearing family, a hearing parents who didn't know about deafness, then you would take the word of those people who were professional and allegedly knew more than you. But the less vigorous parents, parents who weren't willing to campaign like my parents were, took the educationalist word and ultimately their children suffered, and they didn't get anywhere near the aspirations that my brothers and sisters achieved, and they have fallen foul in many ways to the types of problems that the Right Honourable Member for Gordon mentioned a few moments ago in terms of mental health issues and their inability to get employment. And I often wonder what my brothers and sisters could have achieved, albeit they've achieved a lot, but what they could have achieved had they had access to the same education opportunities that I had. So.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, because in my constituency I've got Thomason Memorial School, which is an excellent primary school for deaf children and children with hearing difficulties. And does he agree with me that actually parents should be able to have that, and children should have that choice of whether it is a specialist school for children with disabilities or whether it's in mainstream, but actually the needs of that child should be paramount in any educationalist deciding what's the best education for them to follow?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and the important point here is about choice. If you're going to put your deaf children into a hearing school, you must be supported in that choice, and I'm going to come on a bit in a moment or two to discuss or to mention that particular point. And if it is to be a specialist school, again, the children have to be put in a classroom where they're not just lumped in with a whole bunch of other people together, and that's what drags those children down. Madam Deputy Speaker, time is of the essence, and I'm going to cut a couple of pages of what I was going to say, simply because the Right Honourable Member for Gordon has already mentioned the statistics around deaf people, and I don't think I need rehearse those again. But can I say that when we talk about deafness in general, you have every shade in between. You have people who have lost a little hearing, some perhaps who have lost a little hearing later in life, and then you go right through the spectrum to people who are profoundly deaf. And with a great respect that the tribute was paid to Jack Ashley earlier on, we should remember that Jack became deaf, and he wasn't born deaf. And there's a world of difference for people who have never ever heard the spoken word. And therefore, we go on to the real key issue, which is British Sign Language, the officially recognised language for the deaf, which, again, as the Right Honourable Member for Gordon has said, is diverse, it's colourful and as finessed as any other language in the world. In fact, it may interest you to know that when you get your sign name, that every sign name is unique. So therefore, and some of the signs that have been made for relatives over the years, which I can't possibly do in the House because it can't be recorded on Hansard, would make you chuckle. But in the world of education, Madam Deputy Speaker, the gatekeepers know better, the educationalists, or so they think and so they thought. And members might be surprised or even shocked to learn that teachers of the deaf are expected to have only BSL Level 3 as a qualification. But because, again, as the Right Honourable Member for Gordon has highlighted the fact that there is such a dearth of talent in this field, very often teachers of the deaf are getting jobs and they're being labelled teachers of the deaf, even though they've only got skills at BSL Level 2. It's an aspiration, and it's something that we should seek to increase, and hopefully when the Minister responds he'll be able to deal with this issue in particular, the fact that we should be raising the standards for deaf teachers to ensure that we have the right quality of individual teaching our deaf children. I was thinking about the best way to possibly describe it, and I was thinking about this. It's like asking someone who's just failed their driving test to become a driving instructor. They know a little, but they're not competent, and you wouldn't let them drive on the road. And that's a practical example I could offer by way of analogy, but let me give you another one. My brother Brian also has 5 deaf children, and they all are going to school. His eldest daughter, Monica, is 12 years old, and she has more advanced communication skills than her teachers. They have a BSL level of Level 2, and she is way above that, Level 7 or 8, and perhaps even more. And as she progresses through high school, she's going to meet the challenges. She's going to see the challenges for herself. She's going to become a frustrated child, unable to fulfil her full potential because her teachers are not able to communicate with her properly. What we do need, in my opinion, is a system whereby in primary education and in high school education, that the quality of teachers rises with the child, and the teacher should always be ahead of the child's year and have far advanced communication skills, in order that the child doesn't feel frustrated, then when they're signing something to the teacher in British Sign Language, the teacher understands what their problem is and understands how to communicate. And sadly, we have seen in my family that in many occasions the children are getting frustrated because they are bright, they are real sparky little kids, but they're not getting the opportunities to be educated properly. And the circumstantial evidence that exists that the NDCS has uncovered that local authorities are reluctant to disclose information about deaf education, which is, again, if you want to have a hypothesis on that, you might think it's because they don't want the figures to be revealed. And again, as my right honourable friend from Gordon has said, Ofsted outrageously don't inspect routinely services for the deaf. Local authorities are damaging the life chances of young deaf people across the United Kingdom. And I think this debate has offered the opportunity to expose this argument to a wider audience, not only in this House but in the country. The dangers that those that are already vulnerable face will mean that if there are to be cuts in local government services, deafness is going to once again take a back seat. My father once described the deafness as the Cinderella disability because no one can see it. If we had a physically disabled child, we wouldn't shirk from the cost of providing that child with a physical disability with the support necessary to participate in the education system. So why is it there's such a dearth of ambition and support for deaf children? Local government cannot be allowed to attack the Cinderella disability because they think they can get away with it. And I would argue at the very end, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we should stop paying lip service to equality of opportunities for every child and start doing it.
Fiona Bruce.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.